Well, welcome to week 6 video 2 for PSC 355, and in this video we're going to be discussing the International Monetary Fund. Our central question in this video is, how are debt crises resolved? So at the end of our last video we noted that when a government says that it's no longer willing or able to pay back its creditors and forces a renegotiation to take place, that this is something referred to as a debt crisis. So when we get to this point, what is the way the international financial system gets out of this mess? Today, sovereign debt crises are typically mediated by an international institution known as the IMF, International Monetary Fund, based in Washington, D.C. We'll talk a little bit more about how it's structured here in a few moments. So here's the basic components of how the IMF resolves debt crises. So let's imagine here we have commercial banks or bondholders that have lent money to a sovereign borrower, a government. And that government has been making payments back to those banks over time. But for some reason, that government has now found itself in a tough spot where it's unable or unwilling to continue paying back these debts. So we're at an impasse. What's going to solve this problem? The government has to worry about its long-term reputation. The banks have to worry about getting their money back. So, often in these situations, the International Monetary Fund will step in when the borrower goes to that institution and says, we need some help. We need to pay back our creditors, but we can't do it on our own. We need an emergency loan, or we might call it a bailout today. And so the IMF will provide an emergency credit, a bailout to that sovereign borrower, who's then able to begin making payments to those commercial banks, making those creditors whole, and then slowly the creditor would then begin making payments back to the IMF now, who's also become an external creditor to that government. The IMF is an institution that has 188 member states. Almost every country in the world is a member of the IMF. So where does the IMF get its money from? Where does the IMF get the money to provide these bailouts? Well, each member of the IMF is assigned what's called a quota. A quota is a specified contribution to the fund, and the IMF pools together these resources. The size of the quota reflects the size of the member state's economy. Quota size is also something that's important for determining how much a country can borrow. So if you contribute a lot to the IMF, you're able to borrow more than if you just contribute a small amount. Who controls the IMF? Well, members' voting power is based on their quota size. It's not a one member, one vote system, right? Every member doesn't have one vote. It's rather what we might call a $1 one vote system. So if you take a look here, the United States has by far the most power within the IMF. It has on its own 17% of voting power within that institution. If we look at the European Union, collectively those member states, 17 countries, have about 32% of the voting power. And you can look at the rest of the figure there to get a sense of how the other countries stack up. IMF loans come with what we might say strings attached. I'm going to read you this quote from the IMF conditionality fact sheet. It says, when a country borrows from the IMF, its government agrees to adjust its economic policies to overcome the problems that led it to seek financial aid from the international community. These loan conditions also serve to ensure that the country will be able to repay the fund so that the resources can be made available to other members. Generally, these conditions are referred to or require what we would call austerity measures, right? Reductions in spending, increases in taxation as a way for governments to correct the problems that caused them to seek help in the first place. IMF conditionality, as you might expect, however, is controversial. Anytime an outside organization comes in and says you got to raise taxes, you got to cut spending, which might mean cutting pensions or for government workers, or might mean laying people off, that's going to be unpopular. Take a second here and watch this short clip about what happened recently in Greece when the IMF required austerity on the part of that country.
As the clock ticks on efforts to save Greece from bankruptcy, people in Athens have taken to the streets to protest against possible new austerity measures. The general strike coincided with the return of EU and IMF officials to the city. Without their approval, Greece will not get another bailout. But Greek workers have seen their income slashed in 5 years of cutbacks and they're not in a welcoming mood. They're going to impose even more harsh measures, this man says. More sacrifices will not save us from bankruptcy, this Communist Party leader says. The system must be overthrown. In one isolated incident, some turned their anger on a plainclothes policeman, but the protest was otherwise peaceful.
So you get a sense there about how unpopular austerity measures can be in many cases. There are two perspectives on this. Some say, hey, austerity is necessary. The IMF has to impose these conditions because governments have made poor policy decisions in the first place. That's why they needed a bailout. And so the IMF has to correct that problem. Economic reforms, sure, they may be painful, but they're necessary for the economy to become healthy again in the long term. Others say austerity is bad. It slows economic growth, and it makes the problems worse. As you lay people off or you cut their pensions, they spend less money, the economy is going to stagnate. Austerity also hurts the poor citizens the most. Oftentimes, governments are required to cut social spending, social safety nets that might help the poorest people, and they're on the verge of poverty in the first place. A small cut may cause them to become homeless, or all sorts of bad things can occur. Others critique austerity because they say it's undemocratic. Look, these citizens didn't vote for these policies, and it's being imposed on them anyway. So the IMF conditionality and austerity is something that's not democratic and not in line with those principles.